A routine traffic stop. A trooper's calm voice on the radio. One suspect stepping out. And then nothing. No struggle, no sign of a chase. Just an idling cruiser on the side of Hill Road. For 19 years, there were no answers until a farmer clearing dead brush unearthed something beneath an old oak tree. What they found inside that rusted car didn't solve the mystery. It deepened it. Because Trooper Michael Devlin wasn't in the car, but someone else was. The road stretched like a scar through the rural quiet of Ashe County, where trees loomed over asphalt like silent witnesses, and the night carried more questions than stars. It was October 9th, 1980, a Thursday. Before we walk any further down that quiet stretch of Hill Road where engines die and names fade into wind, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just unsolved cases. They're echoes of lives paused mid-sentence, flickers of memory in places too easily forgotten. Your support helps us keep the lantern lit as we search through dust and shadow. One click lets us stay longer in the silence, listen deeper to the ghosts, and bring light to what was left behind. Thank you. Trooper Michael Devlin, 32 years old, was finishing up the tail end of a routine shift. He'd stopped for coffee at the Chevron off Route 18, joked with the cashier, and checked in over the radio with dispatch just before 10:30 p.m. Nothing out of place. No signs, no warnings. Just another rural patrol through long, dark stretches of forgotten back roads. At 10:47 p.m., a transmission came through. Dispatch, 3011. Out with a vehicle Hill Road, near marker 4-3. Occupied one time. It was standard phrasing, the kind you hear 100 times and forget by the next morning. But that one would be played back until the tape warped and snapped. The dispatcher confirmed. Devlin acknowledged, then static. Not the kind that buzzes and flits like restless insects. This was heavy, blank static. A dead channel that swallowed sound and refused to give it back. What followed was a silence that grew louder with each passing minute. Officers called his unit. No reply. Nearby patrols were dispatched to Hill Road. They found his cruiser on the shoulder, headlights on, engine running, driver's door open, and the red and blues still pulsing weakly into the dark. The interior was immaculate. No blood. No overturned coffee. No torn upholstery. It was as though Devlin had stepped out mid-thought and never returned. His flashlight lay in the grass nearby, about 10 feet from the road, lens cracked. There were no tire marks, no drag trails, no sign of a struggle. The only thing left behind was a jacket button standard issue found near the base of a rust-covered road sign marking Hill Road, nothing else. The official report would later call it a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. But the people who knew Devlin, his wife, his father, his patrol partner called it something else. Impossible. He wasn't the type to run. He was steady, deliberate, the kind of man who checked tire pressure before every shift and never missed a Sunday dinner. A former Marine. A man with roots, discipline, and nowhere else to go but home. Within 12 hours, a full-scale search began. Helicopters, K-9 units, state troopers combing brush and swamp with grim resolve. But as dawn broke, Hill Road gave nothing back. Just mist, silence, and the slow heat of a sun that made everything feel more unreal. No witnesses came forward, no cars matching the vague description of the one Devlin reported. The woods bordering Hill Road were deep, but not unending, and yet, they might as well have been bottomless. His wife, Ellen, sat with reporters that weekend, clutching a photograph of their wedding day. She didn't cry, her voice didn't waver. She simply asked if anyone had seen her husband's face. Not his uniform, not his badge. Just the face of the man who held her hand every morning before he walked out the door. That was the last patrol of Trooper Michael Devlin. A routine stop on a quiet road, swallowed by the kind of darkness you don't just walk back from. For years, Hill Road would carry his absence like a scar the earth refused to heal. And for 19 long years, what happened that night remained one of North Carolina's most haunting questions. Until, without warning, the land itself gave up a secret it had kept buried in silence. There are roads you drive without remembering. And then there's Hill Road, etched, not in memory, but in muscle. Locals didn't avoid it because of potholes or poor signage. They avoided it because something about the air there felt wrong. Too still, too expectant, like it was listening. Before 1980, Hill Road was just a lonely stretch of blacktop carving through pine and oak groves, linking the township of Marlow to a cluster of farmland on the other side of the ridge. People used it because it shaved 5 minutes off the longer way around. But after Trooper Devlin vanished, no one counted minutes anymore. They counted reasons to stay away. It started small, a flat tire here, a stalled engine there. Local teenagers whispered about headlights that blinked out without warning, or music on the radio slowing like someone was dragging the tape with a finger. A woman claimed she drove it in full daylight, and, halfway down the incline near mile marker 43, her windshield fogged over from the inside. Despite the summer heat, her defroster did nothing. She said she felt like she wasn't alone in the car. These weren't stories passed down from generation to generation. They were fresh, close. They belonged to people who still sat in church pews and picked up their mail every morning. And yet, the stories were shared in hushed tones, always with the same look in their eyes, like they were repeating something they didn't quite believe, but couldn't forget either. It didn't help that Devlin's disappearance wasn't the only one. In the years that followed, other names made their way onto flyers, pinned to corkboards and telephone poles. Lana Reeves, 22, last seen hitchhiking. Terry Downs, 47, a trucker whose rig was found abandoned, cab door ajar. They weren't all tied to Hill Road, but the thread felt too thin to ignore. Some said it was the land, that it held on too tightly to what it was given. Others pointed to the old cemetery tucked in the woods just off the bend, a collection of weather-worn stones from the 1800s, half swallowed by moss and ivy. Crosses began appearing there, handmade, unmarked, left by people who never admitted to placing them. Over time, Hill Road gathered more than silence. It gathered a reputation. Real estate agents left it off descriptions. Delivery drivers detoured. GPS apps had a tendency to reroute you around it without prompting. People started calling it cursed, though never in so many words. It was as if the land itself bore a memory when it refused to release. No amount of concrete patching could erase the fracture. The road remained a thin, trembling scar, too quiet and too heavy. And at its center, mile marker 43 stood like a gravestone for a man who never got one. Trooper Devlin's name became shorthand for everything left unresolved. His face, yellowed in old newspaper clippings, stared out from time-stained pages that never printed a follow-up. And so Hill Road stayed open, drivable, but haunted in ways that didn't need ghosts to be felt. Because some wounds don't bleed. They hum, they breathe, and they wait. The logbook entry was brief. 10:47 p.m. traffic stop. Rusted blue Ford. No plates, Hill Road. Mile marker 43. There was nothing remarkable about it at the time, nothing that would signal it as the beginning of something permanent. Devlin had made a dozen stops just like it. That month alone, late-night pullovers for faulty taillights, lapsed registrations, the usual mix of rural forgetfulness and quiet suspicion. But this one would mark the end of his shift, his record, and in many ways, the beginning of a silence that would stretch across decades. Dispatch responded with a routine acknowledgement, and that should have been it. A few minutes later, they expected another transmission. Plate check, driver's license confirmation. Perhaps a citation issued. Instead, they got silence. Not static, not interference. Just a void, blank and deafening. It was a passing motorist who first reported the cruiser, still running, parked awkwardly on the shoulder with its headlights pointed crooked into the tree line. The engine was on. The radio hummed faintly. The emergency lights pulsed red and blue into the empty dark, illuminating nothing but a patch of gravel and weeds. The driver's door was open. There was no sign of Trooper Michael Devlin. When backup arrived 12 minutes later, they expected to find him in the woods or perhaps chasing someone on foot. What they found instead was the kind of scene that didn't make sense, no matter how many times they went over it. His patrol car was untouched. The seatbelt was unfastened, as if he'd simply stepped out mid-sentence. His sidearm was still in its holster, secured. The flashlight he was known for carrying, a heavy-duty maglite, was lying in the ditch nearby, lens cracked, battery missing. It was the only item that seemed out of place. But even that was too subtle, too clean. Not the aftermath of a fight, not dropped in haste, just placed. The ground surrounding the cruiser showed no signs of struggle. No boot prints leading away. No drag marks. No tire treads besides his own. The area had been damp from a light drizzle earlier that evening, and yet the earth told no story. It was as if Devlin had simply stepped into the night and vanished. The truck, the rusted blue Ford, was gone. Not a scrap of paint, not a single flake of metal or fingerprint remained. No one reported seeing it leave. No traffic cams covered that stretch of road in 1980. Witnesses were non-existent. Just the whisper of an engine left running too long. A police radio waiting for a voice that wouldn't return. In the hours that followed, officers fanned out along the roadside, calling his name into the trees. Dogs picked up nothing. The air was heavy, still, as if the forest had swallowed something and refused to give it back. By sunrise, Hill Road had been marked with cones and tape, a sacred site of unanswered questions. There were theories, of course. Maybe he'd chased someone and gotten lost. Maybe he'd been lured, or ambushed, or chosen. But the facts, or lack thereof, refused to fit into anything that resembled logic. What remained was an empty car, an open door, a flashlight without power, and a name that would soon be spoken in the past tense. The call had been routine, the stop uneventful. But the silence that followed, that grew heavier with each passing hour, was anything but. It wasn't the kind of silence that came after a conclusion. It was the kind that lingered when something had only just begun. The audio wasn't clear. It never had been. The tape hissed, the kind of analog warble that came with older radios, common in 1980, even for the state police. But beneath the grainy static, there was something unmistakably human. The clipped rhythm of Trooper Michael Devlin's voice, calm, measured. A man doing his job, following procedure. 3011 to dispatch. Out with 1. Hill Road, near marker 4 to 3. Blue pickup, no tags. A pause, then, one suspect, stepping out. And then nothing. No reply, no follow-up, no escalation in tone, no panic, just silence. Dispatch waited for confirmation. A routine license plate run, a second voice in the background. Maybe Devlin announcing he was issuing a warning or calling for backup. But the seconds stretched. 30, then 60. After 2 full minutes, the operator leaned forward and tried again. 3011, status check. Silence. The procedure required a repeat after 1 minute. Another call out, another pause. There was always the possibility of radio interference, especially in the hills. They told themselves that. Told it to the supervisor on duty, to the other dispatchers now circling the console. But when 3 minutes passed and the screen showed no movement from Devlin's GPS ping, something cold crept into the room. They replayed the message again and again. It wasn't about finding answers anymore, it was about hearing something new. A background noise missed the first time, a scuffle. A voice not belonging to Devlin. But every time they listened, all they heard was what wasn't there. One suspect, stepping out. A simple phrase, but it changed as the hours passed. In the early morning, it was standard protocol. By noon the next day, it was a haunting. The sentence stopped too soon, ending like a candle blown out mid-flicker. You could almost hear what should have come next. Walking toward me, maybe. Uncooperative. Reaching into the glove box. But it never came. That void where a man's words should have been echoed louder than anything he might have said. Some dispatchers swore they heard a noise just after his last word. A small pop. A click. Something organic, not mechanical. Others said it was imagination, tricks of the tape degraded by too many replays. But the department copied it anyway, sealed it, sent it to audio technicians at the State Bureau. The report came back inconclusive. Weeks later, even after the road had been swept, after his cruiser was towed and cleaned, the dispatch center kept that recording in a small, unmarked drawer beneath the console. No one was instructed to do so. It just stayed there. Some nights, new hires would be dared to listen to it in the dark, with headphones on. Most of them did once. A few claimed they heard something at the very end. Not words, not movement, just breath. A single, low exhale that never made it into the transcript. The official record stopped where Devlin's voice did. But for the dispatchers who took his final call, the silence that followed became its own kind of sound. A space too wide to fill. A moment frozen not in time, but in uncertainty. They kept his unit number active for 2 weeks. The screen blinked blue in the corner of the monitor, waiting for a response that never came. Each shift began with someone quietly muting that alert. Not turning it off, just lowering the volume. Like even then, they still hoped the next word would be his. The first 48 hours after Trooper Michael Devlin vanished were a blur of motion and disbelief. In law enforcement, they say the first 2 days are critical. The window where answers are still warm, where trails haven't gone cold, and the landscape still remembers what it saw. But from the very beginning, Hill Road gave nothing. It was like trying to chase a shadow in fog. Every step forward dissolved into silence. By dawn on October 10th, helicopters circled overhead in tight, patient loops, blades chopping through morning mist that rose off the trees like breath. K-9 units swept through underbrush and ravines, noses close to the ground, handlers whispering commands with strained hope. State police officers, deputies, even off-duty personnel who had known Devlin joined in. No one had to be asked. He wasn't just a colleague, he was the dependable one. The one you called when your cruiser wouldn't start in winter, or when you needed a witness you could trust on the stand. Search lines stretched across the woods like a net. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through thickets and low branches, calling his name. Every few minutes, someone would shout to halt, kneel down beside something in the dirt. A boot print, a broken branch, a scrap of cloth, but none of it was his. At 11:12 a.m., they found the flashlight. It was lying half buried in the ditch, about 40 yards down a narrow embankment off Hill Road. It wasn't broken from a fall, no scuff marks, no signs of impact. Just a fine coat of dust clinging to the lens, the beam long since gone cold. When they pried off the back cap, the batteries inside were dead. Not low, not leaking, just gone. No voltage left. As though whatever had happened had pulled every ounce of power from them in one moment. The discovery gave the search momentum, even as it sharpened the dread. The flashlight was his. It had his badge number scratched into the handle with a pocket knife. He always carried it on his belt, even in full daylight. Finding it there meant he'd been pulled off course. Or dragged. They expanded the radius, brought in divers to scour a retention pond 2 miles north, dropped thermal drones into gullies. Still, nothing. No blood, no torn fabric, no shell casings. No signs of a chase or ambush. Just the sound of boots crunching on dry leaves and the quiet hum of radios calling out into emptiness. Back at the command center, hastily assembled in the high school gymnasium. Maps were pinned with red string and notes. The cruiser had been taken apart inch by inch, fingerprinted, dusted, photographed. But it was clean, too clean. The seatbelt buckle was still warm when they'd found it, suggesting he'd gotten out only moments before the passing motorist reported the scene. It didn't make sense. No one just disappears in the middle of a traffic stop, not without noise, not without something breaking. By the second night, the air grew heavier. Hope turned into something slower, something shaped more like ritual than urgency. They lit portable floodlights near the search perimeter. Coffee went cold before it was finished. The troopers who stayed overnight didn't talk much anymore. They just watched the trees, as if expecting them to exhale. It wasn't just that they hadn't found him. It was that they hadn't found anything. No trail, no direction. Devlin had vanished as cleanly as the wind. And in his place, the land had left only bloodless dust, a dead flashlight, and a question that would echo long after the search teams packed up and went home. Ellen Devlin never moved. Not in the way people mean when they say, moved on. The house stayed just as it was in 1980, a modest single-story home with chipped blue siding, a crooked mailbox, and wind chimes that only ever seemed to ring at night. She had offers, of course, family urging her to come live closer, friends suggesting a change of scenery might help with the weight pressing on her chest. But Ellen stayed, anchored to that porch like the final tether between Michael and whatever lay beyond understanding. The chair she sat in was old, even then oak, with one leg shorter than the rest. It gave a slight knock with each rock forward, like a soft knock at a door no one ever answered. She would sit there for hours, wrapped in a heavy gray shawl regardless of the season, hands folded over her lap, eyes locked on the western tree line. She didn't speak much, not to visitors, not even to the reporters who came in the early months, cameras eager to capture heartbreak in perfect lighting. She let them photograph her once, just once. After that, she stopped answering the door. People in town came to expect it. The image of her on that porch became part of the story, part of the mystery. An unmoving silhouette behind the screen door, staring west into memory. Children dared each other to bike past the house at dusk. Adults lowered their voices when they spoke of her in grocery store aisles. Not out of pity, but reverence. Her grief was not loud or messy, it was cathedral quiet, heavy and unchanging. Every evening, just after dinner, she would settle into the chair, the same time her husband used to return from shift. She never checked the clock. She didn't need to. She listened instead to the wind in the pine trees, the far-off echo of engines, the phantom crunch of boots on gravel. The world moved forward. Ellen did not. She waited. There were moments, small ones, that whispered of hope. A phone call from a man claiming to have seen a state trooper matching Michael's description in a Montana bar. A piece of scrap metal mailed anonymously to the station, etched with his badge number. A psychic who insisted Devlin was alive, living under a new name. Each one came and went like the breeze that curled through her porch screen. She listened, nodded, and went back to her chair. To the watching. In the winter, snow would pile in drifts around her boots. She didn't mind. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. When spring came, she'd plant violets beneath the railing. Michael had once said they reminded him of the tie he wore on their wedding day. She watered them, even through droughts. People often said her silence was louder than a scream, that it spoke of a grief so deep it stopped needing language. And they weren't wrong. Over time, even law enforcement officers who passed through town during routine sweeps began to hear about her. The widow who never left her porch, never moved on, never remarried. As though she believed that to do so would be to confirm something she never allowed herself to say out loud, that he was truly gone. Years passed. The town changed. New families moved in, old buildings were torn down. But Ellen remained, still in that chair, still watching the road that had taken everything. And if you stood just close enough, just quietly enough, you might have noticed the way she leaned forward ever so slightly, as if listening for a footstep the earth had long since buried. When facts fall silent, stories begin to speak. And with Trooper Michael Devlin, the silence was deafening. Hill Road gave no answers, no clues, no trail to follow. All that remained was absence, a void, too vast for logic to fill. And into that vacuum rushed speculation, wild and slow-burning, whispered in diners, stitched into barroom arguments, buried beneath the surface of polite conversation at church functions. If the official report had left a blank, the townsfolk filled it in 100 different ways. The first theory was the cleanest. Devlin had run, vanished on purpose, faked his disappearance, and slipped across a state line under cover of darkness. Maybe he'd grown tired of the job. Maybe the uniform had become too heavy. Or maybe there was someone else, another life, another name, waiting for him somewhere else. It was convenient, too convenient. A narrative built on the absence of evidence, not the presence of anything real. His wife refused to entertain it. So did his partner, Tom Calder, who once punched a reporter square in the jaw for printing it on the front page. That man still had his badge on him, Tom had growled. You don't run with your badge still pinned to your chest. Then came the darker talk. A drug bust gone wrong. Rumors of a backwoods operation, a meth lab tucked into a hunting cabin, protected by men who watched patrol patterns and paid attention to names. Maybe Devlin had stumbled onto something he wasn't meant to see. The lack of struggle at the scene, the undisturbed cruiser, some said it pointed to a planned hit, something professional. Quick, efficient, invisible. But the state police had no record of Devlin working narcotics. No wire, no surveillance, no hints in his logs or personal notebooks. If he had known anything dangerous, he'd taken it with him into the dark. Others pointed to a name few dared say out loud. Lester Baines. A drifter and truck mechanic who lived in a trailer on the edge of the county line. Arrested 3 times in the 70 seconds for assault. Known for disappearing for weeks at a time, only to show up dirty and mumbling about things in the woods. He died in 1984, but not before local deputies searched his property in relation to a missing woman. They found bones. Animal, mostly. But the myth stuck. Maybe Hill Road had always belonged to someone or something outside the law. Maybe it wasn't an ambush. Maybe it was a feeding ground. And then there were the ones who looked up instead of around. The lights in the sky crowd. The ones who pointed to weather reports, magnetic interference logs, reports from amateur radio hobbyists who said there was a blackout zone on Hill Road where signals bent or disappeared entirely. One suspect, stepping out. And then total silence. To them, it sounded like the beginning of a visitation. The suddenness, the lack of evidence, the way Devlin seemed to be erased rather than taken. It didn't help that years later, a woman swore she saw a ball of white light hovering just above the treetops near the same mile marker. She refused interviews, said it followed her home, said it never blinked. But none of it held. Not in court, not in case files. Investigators had nothing. Not a blood trail, not a witness, not a license plate. Theories piled up like leaves in fall, dry, shifting, and easily set aflame. But there was nothing to anchor them. Just a cruiser left humming on a lonely stretch of road, and a man whose story now lived only in fragments passed from one mouth to another. Even the seasoned detectives couldn't agree. Off the record, one called it the purest disappearance I've ever seen. Not clean, not clever, just void. A vanishing that didn't follow any pattern and left no trail. As though the man had walked into the fabric of the world and the world had closed behind him without a seam. It didn't start with Trooper Devlin, not exactly. The stories were there if you knew where to look. Old police blotters, faded missing persons reports, yellowed newspaper clippings, filed away in metal cabinets no one had opened in years. Between 1,000, 1,978, and 1,983. 5 people disappeared within 15 miles of Hill Road. Different ages, different backgrounds, no clear link. But one detail echoed across every case: they were alone. The first was Martin Ellis, 52 years old, a traveling insurance adjuster from Raleigh. In October of '78, he left a voicemail for his wife from a payphone near Marlow, saying he'd stop for gas before heading home. He never arrived. His rental car was found 2 days later on the side of County Route 17. Doors locked, briefcase still on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the frost-covered grass. Just his name added to the growing list of question marks. Authorities chalked it up to foul play, highway robbery, maybe. But nothing had been stolen. Next came Lana Reeves, a 22-year-old student hitchhiking her way from Asheville back to UNC. She was last seen by a trucker who dropped her off at the Marlow exit just past dusk in May 1979. She had a green backpack, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and a Walkman clipped to her hip. Search teams later found that backpack leaning against a wooden fence near Hill Road, not thrown, not discarded. Placed zipper closed, contents untouched. The sleeping bag was never recovered, nor was Lana. A year later, July 1980, Michael Parks, 34. A freelance photographer with a fascination for abandoned places, told friends he was exploring the remnants of a Civil War trail system that crisscrossed the woods south of Hill Road. His last known location was a general store near Ridge Hollow, where he bought 2 rolls of Kodak film and a sandwich. His car was found parked in a field, keys still in the ignition, camera bag missing. Not a single image from that day ever surfaced. He was reported missing 1 week before Devlin vanished. After that, the timeline blurred, but the locations held. Debbie Singh, 29, an out-of-state nurse driving cross-country, last spoke to her sister from a roadside phone in August 1982. She said she was somewhere near a long stretch of trees, about to turn back toward the highway. Her rental car was found on a gravel access path 2 miles from Hill Road. Her purse was in the trunk. The driver's seat was adjusted too far forward for someone her height. Nothing else. And finally, in 1983, there was Javier Cortez, a seasonal farm worker last seen walking home from a 4th of July celebration in a neighboring town. He was known to take shortcuts through the woods. A boot matching his size was discovered near a dried-up creek bed off Hill Road weeks later. The leather cracked, the sole pristine. There was no record of any other belongings. His employer described him as reliable, quiet, and unlikely to simply leave. Each case was handled separately, by different departments, across different jurisdictions. And yet, when laid out on a map, a strange pattern emerged. The disappearances formed a crescent arc, all within reach of Hill Road, like fingers pointing to a center that refused to name itself. It wasn't perfect geometry, not the kind you could draw a circle around. But it was close enough to raise questions no one wanted to answer. Investigators at the time insisted there was no evidence to connect the cases. Different timelines, different profiles, no shared vehicles, no known associates. But local lore began to pull at the thread, tying the vanishings together into a single, unease-filled narrative. Some began to refer to it not as 5 separate losses, but as the Marlow Drift. A slow, quiet unraveling that moved through the landscape, touching people at random, taking without explanation. Was it coincidence? A tragic clustering of unrelated events? Or was it something more, a hidden pattern, visible only in hindsight, lost in the spaces where official records failed to connect the dots? One thing was clear. When Devlin disappeared, the wound reopened. Not because he was a cop, but because his case fit. Another name. Another empty place on the map. And this time, the silence felt familiar. Like the land had simply reached out again and taken what it needed. In the years following Trooper Michael Devlin's disappearance, time moved forward, as it always does. indifferent to the unresolved. But on one day each year, time bent just slightly around a quiet place marked only by a faded green sign, mile marker 43. Hill Road had no memorial, no plaque or statue. There was no official designation, no historical marker to commemorate the mystery that hung in the air like fog. But those who remembered didn't need one, they came anyway. It began the year after, October 9th, 1981. A single bouquet of wildflowers left at the base of the mile marker, yellow daisies and Queen Anne's lace, wrapped in twine. No note, no name. Just the quiet gesture of someone refusing to let the silence settle. The next year, there were two. A child's drawing of a police badge in crayon. A votive candle in a jam jar, its flame flickering in the breeze like it was trying to speak. Over time, the tradition took root not as ceremony, but as ritual. Each anniversary brought more signs, folded paper cranes. A small American flag. Once, someone tied a dog tag around the post, stamped not with Devlin's name, but with the words, "Still here." People never stayed long. They'd drive up slowly, leave their offering, and go. No speeches, no photos, just brief visits to acknowledge the absence that refused to grow old. The mile marker itself began to change. It had always stood slightly crooked, but now the lean was more pronounced, as if gravity was slowly bending it under the weight of what it represented. The paint chipped away in layers, revealing rust beneath. Birds perched there only briefly, as though unwilling to rest too long. It wasn't just a signpost anymore. It was a marker of something heavier, something that couldn't be charted on a map or measured in distance. Locals spoke of the spot with a kind of reverence. Kids were warned not to linger there after dark, though few ever did. Truckers would sometimes tap their horns as they passed, a small nod to a fallen brother no one could properly lay to rest. And though the years stretched on, the flowers never stopped coming. Ellen Devlin never visited the site herself, or if she did, no one saw her. But some believed she sent someone in her place. A teenage neighbor who suddenly took to driving out that way every October. A retired officer who'd once served on Michael's shift, spotted once kneeling beside the post, whispering something to the wind. There was something in the act of remembrance that defied resolution. Even though no body had been found, even though no answers ever surfaced, the gesture continued year after year, decade after decade. It wasn't hope, not exactly. Hope required some expectation of return. This was quieter, more resigned. Like tending a grave you could never locate, but somehow still felt beneath your feet. And so, the mile marker remained crooked, weathered, dressed in small tributes like scars made of kindness. It didn't explain anything. It didn't bring anyone back, but it refused to forget. In a world that so easily moves on, that in fact demands it, that crooked post stood still, a sentinel not of memory, but of endurance, of the insistence that even in absence, someone must be seen, must be acknowledged, must be carried forward, even when there is nothing left to hold. The summer of 1999 was dry in a way the region hadn't seen in decades. Crops withered on their stalks, ponds shrank into cracked basins, and the soil turned brittle beneath Harold Penrose's boots. For a man who had worked the land his whole life, the drought wasn't just a nuisance, it was a quiet threat, whispering ruin with every cloudless day. To save what little pasture he had left, Harold decided to expand westward, into a patch of woods that his father had always deemed off limits. Not because of any superstition, he'd said, but because the land was rocky, full of deadfall and bad footing, useless for anything but shade. But desperate times bend old rules. So one morning in late August, Harold climbed into his backhoe and began to clear brush from the ridge behind his property, a gentle rise covered in thorns and saplings and the bones of trees long fallen. He didn't expect much, just enough flat earth to keep his remaining cattle fed. The sun was already high, and the air shimmered with heat when the blade of his tractor struck something solid. Not rock. Metal. The sound rang out sharp and unnatural in the dry air. At first, he thought it might be a rusted drum or old fencing. But as he stepped down and kicked away the earth with the toe of his boot, the shape beneath became unmistakable. Smooth curvature. Paneling. A strip of chrome half swallowed by roots. He dropped to his knees, hands scraping dirt away like a man uncovering a coffin. What emerged was the corner of a vehicle. Not buried deep, only masked by decades of leaf fall and neglect. The more Harold cleared, the more it revealed itself, piece by piece, like a memory clawing its way to the surface. A car, a patrol car, faded white paint, a cracked spotlight. And on the front quarter panel, barely visible beneath the rust, the remnants of black stenciled letters, State Trooper. His hands trembled as he stepped back. He didn't call the sheriff immediately. He stood there first, for nearly an hour, staring at it. Because Harold Penrose remembered the stories. Everyone around Marlowe did. Hill Road, mile marker 43. The trooper who vanished into thin air and never came back. The road they still avoided. The flowers that still appeared every October. For 19 years, it had all been myth, a wound without a scar. But this was real. Cold metal and shattered glass beneath a rotted oak. When the authorities arrived, Harold stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, watching as they circled the find with wide eyes and tight voices. The cruiser was half sunken into the dirt, like it had been slowly pulled into the earth. No obvious drag marks, no path indicating how it got there. The location was nowhere near Hill Road, at least 6 miles from the original scene. Over uneven terrain and through densely wooded ridges. No road led in, no road led out. Reporters came the next day. So did forensic teams, archaeologists, state investigators. The headlines declared a breakthrough. Found, missing trooper's vehicle after 19 years. But Harold Penrose, watching from his porch with a cold cup of coffee and a deeper furrow in his brow, said nothing. Because what gnawed at him wasn't just the where but the how. How had it gotten there, under that ancient oak his father never touched? Why had no one seen it, smelled it, stumbled across it in all those years? And as the sun set over the ridge and the wind picked up, rattling through trees now stripped of their secrets, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that history hadn't surfaced, it had been stirred. That something buried was no longer content to sleep. It took nearly 6 hours to fully unearth the vehicle. The tow team worked slowly, not just because of the fragile state of the soil, but because no one wanted to damage anything that might be considered evidence. The cruiser's roof had caved slightly inward, as though pressed by the weight of seasons. Roots had crept up through the undercarriage and curled inside the wheel wells, like fingers clutching at a memory. But there was no mistaking it, this was Trooper Michael Devlin's car. The VIN matched. The license plate, though rusted, still bore the numbers last recorded in the official disappearance report. It had not been modified. Not repainted. It had simply been left. The driver's door was fused shut by time, but the passenger side opened with effort. Inside, the vehicle was mostly intact. Dust coated everything in a thin, ghostly film. On the front seat, they found a pair of cracked sunglasses and a folded incident report, with Devlin's handwriting frozen in a moment no one could explain. The radio was still tuned to the original dispatch frequency, its speaker long dead. The most unsettling detail, though, was the ignition. The keys were still in it, inserted. Ready. Like someone had meant to drive away and never did. There were no signs of damage, no blood, no bullet holes, no fingerprints other than Devlin's. The back seat was empty. The trunk pried open only after 2 sets of lock tools failed, revealed the standard contents of a patrol unit. A first aid kit, flares, a flashlight, soggy from corrosion. And underneath a crumpled emergency blanket, a single envelope. Unmarked, yellowed with age. Inside was a driver's license that didn't belong to Devlin. The name and face on it hadn't appeared in any of the case files tied to his disappearance. It belonged to a man declared legally dead 4 years before Devlin went missing. As puzzling as the contents were, the location of the vehicle made even less sense. The cruiser had last been seen on Hill Road, a paved and accessible stretch. This patch of ridge where the car now sat was secluded, steep, and without any visible entry point. No old trail wide enough for a vehicle. No evidence of soil disturbance indicating it had been moved there recently. It would have taken a Herculean effort, winches, manpower, heavy equipment to move the car here without leaving some trace. But there was nothing. No tire tracks, no worn grass, no broken tree limbs. It was as though the car had dropped from the sky or risen from the ground, placed like an artifact waiting to be found. The forensic team took samples of the surrounding dirt, hoping to find evidence of recent disturbance, but the soil showed consistent layering, no signs of digging. The cruiser hadn't just been put there. It had been there, for years, maybe all 19, hidden under bark and moss, silently decaying in sync with the land around it. News of the discovery spread quickly. For many, it felt like a grim kind of closure. The car was proof. Tangible. Real. Something the world could finally hold on to. But for those who had lived with the story for nearly 2 decades, the questions had only multiplied. How had it gotten there? Why had no one found it sooner? What did it mean that the car was so far from where it was last seen, untouched by time and yet heavy with it? And still, no one had an answer to the most urgent question of all: where was Michael Devlin? His badge had not been found in the car, nor his weapon, nor any trace of him at all. The cruiser had been returned. But the man who drove it was still missing, still part of the silence that clung to Hill Road like fog that refused to lift. The interior of the cruiser had become a time capsule, sealed beneath earth and rot, the years compressing around it like layers of forgotten sediment. When the passenger door was finally forced open, a musty wave of decay and metal rolled out into the hot afternoon air, a breath exhaled after 19 years of silence. Dust hung in the sunlight like suspended ash. Inside, it was as though time had folded in on itself. Nothing had moved, yet everything had changed. On the passenger seat sat something that stopped the forensic team in their tracks: a trooper's badge. Not clipped to a shirt, not pinned to a belt or vest, but lying there alone, like it had been placed with care. The metal was warped, the edges bubbled slightly, as if it had been exposed to heat, but there was no sign of fire. The upholstery around it was untouched, no burn marks, no soot. Just that badge, heat distorted and silent, as though it had passed through something the rest of the vehicle hadn't. The badge number matched Michael Devlin's. Its presence raised more questions than it answered. Devlin's badge had never been recovered at the original scene. He was presumed to have still been wearing it the night he disappeared. But now here it was, decades later, resting atop the passenger seat in his own cruiser, untouched and out of place. It was as though someone had returned it, as though something had. The rest of the interior was sparse. The logbook had disintegrated to pulp. His gloves were missing. The floor mats curled at the edges, dry and brittle. But the real discovery was in the trunk. The lock mechanism resisted at first, rusted and fused by years of exposure, but eventually gave way under pressure. The lid lifted with a moan, revealing the expected contents: roadside flares, a half-empty oil can, a damp spare uniform sealed in a crumbling plastic bag. But wedged into the rear corner, half concealed beneath the emergency blanket, was a sealed evidence bag. It was pristine, clean plastic, ziplocked shut. Inside, a North Carolina driver's license, unmarred by age or elements. The name printed on it was Douglas Ray Keller. The date of birth, 1939. And a small red sticker indicating the license had been renewed just once before Keller was declared dead in 1975. The investigators checked the database 3 times. There was no mistake. Keller had died in a boating accident off the Outer Banks. Body recovered, Death certified. Family notified. His name hadn't appeared in any of the original Devlin case files. He had no known connection to law enforcement, to Hill Road, or to Devlin himself. Yet here, his license was carefully preserved in an evidence bag that didn't match the cataloging style used in 1980. No date stamp, no initials. Just clean, silent plastic, and the ghost of a man who shouldn't have been part of the story. Theories formed quickly and dissolved just as fast. Had Devlin found the license the night he vanished? Had he been investigating Keller for some reason unknown to the department? Or was the license planted there long after left behind as a message or a warning? But who would keep it so perfectly sealed for almost 20 years? Who would return it, just in time for someone to find it again? Inside the cruiser, nothing else gave way. The glove box held only dust. The ashtray was empty. The rearview mirror had fallen and lay shattered on the floorboard. And above all, there was still no sign of Devlin. No bone, no clothing, no trace. Only the badge, misshapen by an invisible heat. And the license of a dead man who had, somehow, stepped back into the mystery. In the days following the recovery of Trooper Michael Devlin's cruiser, the investigation surged with a sense of purpose that hadn't existed in nearly 2 decades. The car's discovery was supposed to provide answers, a conclusion to a long open wound. But instead, it unraveled something far stranger. Forensics teams worked tirelessly under the heat of the late August sun, peeling back the layers of rust and soil and silence that had swallowed the vehicle whole. What they found wasn't a resolution. It was a redirection. A detour into something older, colder, and far more disturbing. It was the forensic anthropologist who spotted it first. Wedged deep beneath the rear passenger floorboard, concealed by time and rot, was something that didn't belong. At first, they thought it was just more debris, a tangle of twigs or small animal remains that had somehow gotten in through the decayed undercarriage. But the shape was too clean, too structured. What they extracted came in pieces, fragile, discolored, crumbling at the edges. Bone, not Devlin's, not an adult's. The fragments were consistent with a juvenile female. The size of the femur, the curvature of the ribs, the spacing of the jaw, each detail quietly confirmed the truth. These were the remains of a child, likely no older than 10. There were no identifying features, no clothing remnants, no shoes, no jewelry. Only bone, weathered but sheltered by the cruiser's steel frame. She had been there a long time, maybe longer than the car itself. The discovery struck the investigative team like a blunt object. It collapsed the narrative they had barely begun to rebuild. Devlin's car was not a grave, it was a container. And now, it held someone else's tragedy. The forensic timeline grew murky. Tests on the bone marrow were inconclusive due to degradation, but estimates placed the child's death somewhere between 1975 and 1985, a 10-year window, wide enough to muddy every working theory. They scoured missing persons reports from across the state, reaching back into decades of faded ink and forgotten names. Over a dozen young girls had vanished in that span. Runaways, custody disputes, cases marked insufficient evidence or no foul play suspected. Some had been ruled solved. Others were simply shelved. But none matched precisely. No DNA matches, no dental records. The girl in the cruiser remained unnamed, her presence unexplained. The implications were dizzying. Had she been there the whole time? Had Devlin discovered her body, triggering whatever led to his own disappearance? Or was she placed there afterward, as a kind of message, a kind of echo? The cruiser had no obvious signs of forced entry from the past 19 years. The doors were sealed. The car hadn't been moved, at least not recently. And if she had been hidden there the night he vanished, why hadn't the scent drawn dogs during the original search? Why hadn't decomposition left more visible traces? The theory that chilled the room most was whispered, not spoken aloud. That she had not been in the car when it disappeared in 1980, that her bones had arrived sometime after, placed deliberately, carefully, as if someone was rewriting the story in real time, inserting new horrors into an already open wound. Whatever her name, however she had died, she was now part of the legend. A different ghost tied to the same road. A mystery hiding inside another, nested like a secret that had waited for just the right moment to surface. Trooper Devlin was still missing. But now, he wasn't the only one. The case, once defined by a single vanishing, had expanded into something wider, something more sinister. The hills had held their silence long enough. Now, they were starting to speak, but only in fragments, only in bones. The name on the license, Douglas Ray Keller, meant nothing to the younger members of the investigative team. Just another piece of a decades-old jigsaw puzzle, faded and incomplete. But to those who had been around long enough to remember, the name stirred something older, something uneasy. Douglas Keller had once owned a modest parcel of land just south of Hill Road, tucked away at the edge of the tree line, past a rusted cattle gate and a long-forgotten trailhead. He was a quiet man, solitary, reclusive in a way that drew whispers, but never quite suspicion. Until the fire. In February of 1981, a blaze swept through Keller's property, reducing the small farmhouse to charred timber and smoking soil. No one was home when fire crews arrived, no bodies found in the rubble. The blaze was labeled suspicious. Accelerants were found near the foundation, but no arrests were made. Keller hadn't been seen for weeks before the fire, and after, he was never seen again. In the absence of a body, and with no living relatives to press the issue, he was eventually declared dead by default, a formality signed off on by the county clerk in 1985. Case closed, more or less. No memorial service, no obituary, just a line drawn through his name. But now, nearly 2 decades later, that name had resurfaced in the most unlikely of places inside an evidence bag, sealed tight in a cruiser buried beneath a dead oak. His license, in pristine condition, as though untouched by time or weather, had shattered the assumption that he had died in the fire. It suggested, instead, that he hadn't died at all. Or if he had, it hadn't been in 1981. Theories sprouted fast, wild, and contradictory. Was Keller alive when Devlin disappeared? Had their paths crossed? Was Keller the man Devlin pulled over that night? The one suspect, stepping out just before the radio cut to silence? If so, what happened in the 10 minutes between that last transmission and the discovery of the idling cruiser? And more pressingly, what happened in the years after? The investigative team combed through old property records, interviewing locals who were still around to remember. Most recalled Keller as odd but unthreatening. He was rarely seen in town, often purchasing supplies through mail order or trading with neighboring farmers. Some recalled the fire vividly, the smoke visible from miles away, the smell of scorched timber hanging in the air for days. One woman remembered that the fire started the same week. Someone had spray painted, "Where is she?" in red across Keller's mailbox. That detail had never made it into the original police report. There were no bank accounts in his name after 1980. No employment records, no sightings. It was as if Keller had vanished into smoke until the license surfaced. That document, sealed and hidden, was more than just a relic. It was a signal. A breadcrumb pointing back to a man who may have been closer to the center of Devlin's disappearance than anyone realized. And yet, even this discovery brought more confusion than clarity. If Keller had something to do with the missing trooper, why leave the license behind? Why preserve it so carefully, and why hide it in the very car that vanished the same night? It felt intentional, like a message, or a signature. But written in a language no one could translate. Investigators knew one thing for certain: the narrative had shifted. Devlin's case was no longer isolated. The fire, the license, the missing girl's bones, these were not separate stories. They were points on a line that curved back toward Hill Road, drawing tighter with each revelation. Keller had once disappeared into fire. Now he had returned through ash, and nothing about it felt accidental. The box was discovered 2 days after the cruiser, during a secondary sweep of the ridge where Harold Penrose had unearthed the patrol car. A rusted tin lunchbox, barely visible beneath a blanket of pine needles and brittle leaves, tucked beneath the roots of a split cedar tree, roughly 50 yards downslope from where the cruiser had been lodged. It was the kind of object easily missed, camouflaged by time and rot, overlooked in a scene already saturated with mystery. But a cadaver dog paused near it, not with alert, but curiosity. The handler, trained to follow instinct as much as protocol, knelt and brushed away the detritus. What emerged was not a body, but a voice. Inside the tin were 6 carefully folded letters, stained at the edges but mostly legible, each sealed in wax paper, as though someone had taken great care to protect their contents from the elements. The pages had yellowed with age, the ink faded into a ghostly blue. But the script was steady, elegant, and every envelope was addressed the same way: MD, no return address, no dates. Just the initials. The first letter began, "I see you now. I know you still wear the uniform, but not for the same reasons anymore. You're looking like I am. I feel it when the wind shifts near the trees." The language was poetic, unnerving. A blend of longing and warning. The writer referenced places only someone familiar with the Marlow woods would know: the hollow near the broken fence, the trail past the dry well, where it goes quiet even when the birds are singing. There was an intimacy in the voice, but not romantic. It read like a confession or a pact. Each letter grew darker. The second spoke of watching someone bury something beneath the ash tree, and the third claimed they took her to keep us quiet. The fifth contained only 4 lines. "You have to follow it back. You have to see what they did to her. If they find this, it's because I finally told the truth." It was the final letter that shifted everything. It ended with a name, scrawled in small, tentative script. Not the writer's, but the name of a missing girl from 1979, Lydia Harrow. Lydia had vanished at age 17, last seen walking home from a summer job at a roadside farm stand. Her case had never been linked to Devlin's, and her name hadn't come up in connection with Douglas Keller either. But when investigators compared the handwriting from a school notebook provided by her surviving family, the match was nearly perfect. The letters had been written by Lydia, and somehow they had survived underground for 2 decades, sealed in a box buried just a stone's throw from Devlin's long-lost cruiser. The implications were staggering. If Lydia had written these letters, she hadn't disappeared in 1979, at least not completely. She'd lived long enough to write at least 6 messages to someone she referred to only as M.D. Did she mean Michael Devlin? Had they crossed paths before he vanished? Were they working together? Had she tried to tell him something? Worse still, some lines in the letters suggested that whoever had taken Lydia, if that's what happened, was still watching. Still nearby. One passage read, "They walk like they belong here, but they don't. They know the way through the trees without stepping on a sound." For investigators, the diary didn't bring resolution. It reopened a case they hadn't known was unfinished, and tied it to a man whose name had become synonymous with the unexplained. Devlin hadn't just disappeared. He had been circling something, or someone. And now, in the shape of faded paper and a girl's desperate voice, that something was circling back. For a brief, flickering moment, the discovery of Trooper Michael Devlin's cruiser had promised clarity. After 19 years of unanswered questions, the unearthed car, the sealed evidence bag, the buried letters, each felt like a key about to turn in a long rusted lock. But instead of opening doors, they only revealed more shadows behind them. And as quickly as the investigation reignited, the silence returned. Not the silence of neglect or inattention, but the kind that follows a scream no one heard in time. A stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from the exhaustion of knowing too much and understanding too little. The car had offered no trail. Its location, miles from the scene of Devlin's last transmission, still defied explanation. A full geological scan of the area beneath the ridge confirmed what investigators already feared. There was no evidence the cruiser had been driven, towed, or dragged to the site. No soil compression, no vegetation disturbance, no marks from heavy equipment. It was as though the ground had simply accepted it, allowed it to settle undetected for nearly 2 decades. That impossible stillness, that absence of motion, unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. It felt less like a discovery and more like a trap that had waited until just the right moment to spring. The bones, too, remained mute. Despite exhaustive testing, the remains of the child found beneath the cruiser yielded no usable DNA. Time had leached the marrow of its identity. Attempts to cross-reference the dimensions and age estimates against missing persons reports from the region produced nothing definitive. Too many names, too few markers. The child had died in silence, remained in silence, and now re-entered the world still cloaked in it. She had been folded into the mystery like another page torn from a book no one could find the beginning of. And the letters, those strange, almost lyrical fragments from someone who may have been Lydia Harrow, offered only deeper ambiguity. The match in handwriting suggested she had survived her own disappearance, but no one knew for how long. No one could say if she had ever met Devlin face to face. No fingerprints had been recovered from the pages. No recent sightings had ever been reported. It was as if the moment the last letter was written, she too vanished again. This time even more completely. Her words hinted at something beneath the surface, something walking in plain sight. But she never named it. Investigators briefed the public once more, holding a press conference that felt both urgent and hollow. Cameras captured expressions of concern, promises of follow-up, requests for any new information. But there was a weariness behind the eyes of those at the podium. They had not found Devlin. They had not explained the car, the bones, or the diary. They had found something, certainly, but no one could name what it was. In town, the talk faded back to murmurs. The energy that had flared when the cruiser was discovered slowly dimmed, as though the land itself had drawn breath and then exhaled again, settling into its old rhythm. Flowers still appeared at mile marker 43, but now they came with notes written in smaller, tighter script. People drove Hill Road with headlights on, even at noon. The silence returned, but it was no longer clean. It pulsed with implication, with presence. What they had uncovered wasn't closure. It was a widening, a deepening. The story had never been just about a trooper who disappeared. It had always been about something older, more elusive, something that left just enough behind to keep you looking, but never enough to let you truly see. The case file remained open, thicker now, but no closer to resolution. In the center of it sat a car that should not have moved, a child no one could name, and a set of letters written by a girl whose last words now seemed to echo back through the trees. They walk like they belong here, but they don't. The longer the investigation lingered, the more difficult it became to separate evidence from atmosphere, truth from suggestion. Hill Road had always been just a road, 2 lanes of aging asphalt flanked by trees and overgrowth, an unremarkable stretch of rural infrastructure barely noted on state maps. But as more stories surfaced, more connections, some faint, some glaring, were drawn back to this place. A quiet belief began to grow, not just among locals, but among those tasked with untangling the facts. That Hill Road was no longer just geography. It was something else. A threshold, maybe. Or a wound. Or worse, a kind of magnet. It was hard to ignore the patterns. The vanishing of Trooper Devlin. The reappearance of his cruiser 19 years later in an impossible location. The bones of a child hidden beneath it. The letters buried nearby. The name of a presumed dead farmer threaded through it all like a frayed stitch. Too much had unraveled here for it to be coincidence. Yet none of it connected in ways that obeyed logic. That's what gnawed at the investigators, even the seasoned ones, the sense that the more they learned, the less reality held shape. Hill Road didn't offer clues so much as it suggested them, like a whisper half heard from a room you can't enter. The place had a rhythm, a strange temporal quality. Some who walked the stretch near mile marker 43 described a sensation like déjà vu, the feeling that they had been there before, even when they hadn't. Equipment batteries failed inexplicably. GPS systems looped or froze. More than one officer claimed to have walked a straight path into the woods and ended up back at the road without ever turning around. Dogs refused to cross a particular ditch line past the fifth bend. One refused to leave the cruiser's side until physically carried away, its body trembling, eyes fixed on the tree line like it expected something to step out. And there were more whispers, too many to catalog, often dismissed but never truly forgotten. A boy in 1987 who went missing for 4 hours and returned unharmed but unable to speak for days, found barefoot on the edge of Hill Road with dried pine needles in his mouth. A woman in 1992 who crashed her car into a tree near mile marker 43 and claimed she'd swerved to avoid a man in uniform standing in the road. When shown a photo of Devlin from 1980, she turned pale and asked if he had a daughter. No one could explain what she meant. She refused to speak of it again. For some in law enforcement, Hill Road was an anomaly. For others, it was something more unsettling. A place that didn't forget. A place that remembered things people tried to bury. They began calling it the Echo Line in their notes, unofficial, unspoken. A road where events didn't just happen but repeated. Where trauma rippled outward like sound waves in still water. A road that didn't just lead somewhere, it led through something. It was as if time folded in on itself here. Moments overlapped, names returned, faces blurred across decades. Some believed it was psychological collective hysteria, primed by tragedy and fed by myth. But others weren't so sure. Because while theories rose and fell like the seasons, the evidence, the car, the bones, the letters remained. And with each passing year, it seemed more and more that Hill Road wasn't just the backdrop to a mystery. It was the mystery. An invisible current, flowing beneath the ground, drawing in what it could, refusing to give it back whole. Whatever the truth was, it didn't live in any single document or testimony. It lived in the curve of the road, in the wind through the trees, in the echo of a radio call that still hung in the air long after the static had faded. The paperwork was filed quietly, without ceremony. On a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2000, exactly 20 years and 1 day after his disappearance, Trooper Michael Devlin was declared legally dead in absentia. The court proceedings were brief, administrative, and devoid of the emotion that had defined the case for 2 decades. There was no new evidence, no sudden lead or recovered body to justify the declaration. It was, as the judge put it, a legal formality necessitated by the passage of time. But time, in this case, had not healed. It had only obscured. The filing didn't bring relief to those who had carried the weight of his absence. It only marked the point where the world officially gave up waiting for him to walk back through the door. Ellen Devlin didn't attend the court hearing. She already knew the words wouldn't bring him home. Instead, she spent the day as she had so many others on the porch, in that same worn rocking chair, facing west. The shawl around her shoulders had frayed. The wooden planks beneath her feet had warped slightly with years of weather, but her eyes never shifted. When asked later if the declaration changed anything for her, she only replied, "I didn't need a judge to tell me he wasn't coming back." Yet even in the silence of loss, she refused to surrender to closure. She continued setting a place for him at dinner on the anniversary of his disappearance. She replaced the flowers on their wedding photo every spring. And some nights, just after the sun sank behind the tree line, Neighbors swore they saw her whisper something into the wind, though no one could ever hear the words. As for Harold Penrose, the farmer who unearthed the cruiser, he never worked that ridge again. After the investigators packed up, after the cameras left and the caution tape was pulled down, Harold locked the gate leading to that part of his property and refused to open it. "The land doesn't want to be touched there," he told a reporter once. "And I won't make that mistake again." He planted no crops near the ridge. Let the weeds return. Let the trees reclaim what was theirs. He said little after that summer, retreating into a life of small habits and fewer conversations. But those closest to him noticed a change. A tightening in his shoulders, a nervous glance toward the ridge at dusk. He had found something that day, but whether it was truth or simply something the earth had meant to stay buried, no one could say. The investigation, technically, remained open. Files stayed in drawers, reports were updated. But everyone understood what that meant. It was a shell, kept upright out of obligation. No new evidence emerged, no suspects, no final scene drawn in tape or chalk. Only the residue of possibility, thick and stubborn. Because some stories refuse to end, they don't conclude so much as they echo through soil, through silence, through lives that never return to what they were. The land along Hill Road still hums with unanswered questions. The mile marker still leans slightly, like it's bowing under the weight of what was never said. And somewhere beyond it all, beneath the canopy of trees that never stopped growing, something remains unclaimed, unresolved, and unwilling to rest. Because sometimes, what's found doesn't clarify. It confounds. Sometimes, the cruelest thing the earth can do is give something back.